I will be all ears.
Mr. Chairman. The Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr. Chairman, it's a bit of a shame to have to take the call when we have a minister in the chair that doesn't even know what the bill is. She didn't even know she was meant to be in the chair, Mr. Chairman, and that really degrades the importance of passing legislation through this House. Because what I wanted to do in the short title and commencement, was to ask the questions of the minister in the chair that earlier ministers in the chair that were equally ignorant about the bill had failed to answer. And if we're going to take up the time of the taxpayer and the time of the House to have a proper debate on the bill, we need to have a minister in the chair that knows what the bill is. And it makes a farce of this place if the minister doesn't. Oh, the minister says she does. Well, look, I've got some questions of the minister. The first question is this. If we look at the short title, we see that this Act is to be the Trade Safeguard Measures Act 2008. 2008. Well, my question, Minister, to you first of all, is why are we still debating this bill 6 years after it was introduced? 6 years after it was introduced. I think the minister in the chair owes it to the House and owes it to the country to explain why it's taken 6 years to get a relatively straightforward piece of legislation to the point that it still hasn't even got through its committee stages. This bill was sent to a select committee in the very first weeks of the first term of the national government. We're now in the last weeks of the last term of the national government, and we haven't passed this legislation. So, Minister, we on this side of the House expect you to take the call and explain to us whether it was just poor management of the House, that the government just has never got its act together to manage its legislative agenda, or is it sheer incompetence? Were there problems with the bill that they couldn't come to terms with? Was there incompetence in managing the bill? Oh, the minister has left the chair. That's maybe the minister that's just assumed the chair, who was meant to know something about this bill, even if he's late in arriving to hear the discussion on it, will answer these questions. Why, Minister Foss, has it taken 6 years to get this bill to the point where it is now? Is it incompetence? Is it poor management? Is it partly because the minister that was in charge of this bill was a guy called John Banks? And the last thing the national government wanted to do was have John Banks in the chair and subject to scrutiny. Whichever way you look at it, it's hard to imagine why a government takes more than 6 years to get through a piece of legislation that is supposedly necessary. If it's necessary, why wasn't it got through the House much earlier, Minister Foss? Why has it taken this long? I want to raise some other questions about it. Actually, the Labor government is supporting this bill. The Labor Party is supporting the bill. The Labor government introduced it, and the Labor government is supporting it. I don't want to have to wait till the next Labor government, albeit only a few months' time, to actually get it through. But, you know, this is about trade safeguards. I'm a person that believes in freeing up trade, so why would we have trade safeguards? Well, there are some very good reasons for having trade safeguards. You need trade safeguards when other countries decide to dump their products in your country at below the value of the product. That's not fair trade. It's not a level playing field. It can damage your local industry, and there's a clear argument for having anti-dumping trade safeguards. But that's covered, it's touched on in this legislation, but it's covered in another piece of legislation. There is an argument too for having countervailing duties. You put countervailing duties on when the exporter is from a country where the government of that country is subsidising the exports, and again it's not fair competition. We don't mind here in New Zealand competing with anybody on a level playing field, but if another government is subsidising the product so it can outcompete our industries that are standing on their own feet, that would also be unfair trade. But again, that's touched on in the bill, but it's not the central purpose of the bill. The central purpose of this bill is to actually provide for temporary protection when a domestic industry might be faced with increased imports and it needs time for adjustment. But the question I've got for Minister Foss on this is, which industries are we talking about that actually require this sort of protection? Because actually our tariff levels are generally either non-existent or below 5%, and I can't think of the last time, Minister, when these sort of temporary safeguards were actually used. So can the Minister, it's a genuine question, Mr Chairman,
The Honourable Phil Goff.
can the Minister explain to the House when was the last time that temporary safeguards were used for the purpose that is set out in this bill? Which are the industries that potentially need protecting, and against what countries? That's a basic piece of information that the Parliament and the country is entitled to know. Mr Speaker, I think that the bill can be justified, but my experience is also that trade safeguards can sometimes be utilised in a way that aren't productive of fair trading. And a number of members of this House have just come back to New Zealand from a trip to China, where we're asking questions there about the trade safeguard, the agricultural special safeguard measures that are impacting on the dairy industry. And I know my colleague Damien O'Connor is particularly interested in this. I negotiated that trade agreement, and we put the special agricultural safeguards, trade safeguard mechanisms in, because frankly we wouldn't have got the free trade agreement without it. The Ministry of Agriculture in China is still fuming about the fact that we have negotiated the total phase-out of tariffs. But I've got to say, if you look at the Chinese example and relate it to what this bill is about, Mr Chairman, that those safeguards aren't really justified by the reality. Yes, our exports have gone up rapidly. When we set the trade safeguard levels, they were set at a level well above the level of trade. And within 5 years, there's been a five-fold increase in dairy exports. And so people are paying that trade safeguard mechanism actually in the first month of the trading year, and it's costing us some tens of millions of dollars. Now, the Chinese would be able to justify that if there was damage, as this bill sets out, to the local industry. But there is no evidence that what we are doing is damaging the local industry. Yes, dairy production in China has dipped, but not for the reason of competition. The reason we're sending the volume of trade into China that we are is because of the demand. The demand has gone up. We're simply meeting the demand. So we're faced with a situation where a trade safeguard mechanism is being employed, but without justification for doing it. I don't think that's what this bill provides for New Zealand. And of course we asked about whether we might renegotiate those trade safeguard measures with China, and the answer is, why would they give us something and get nothing in return? There would be a quid pro quo, and since the trade safeguard measures are only transitional, they're phased out by the early 2020s, then we probably won't be able to do anything about it. So that's an example, Mr Chair, of where a trade safeguard mechanism can be utilised as a revenue-grabbing mechanism, but without being justified by an actual need to protect a local industry. In this bill, we say it's about protecting the local industries, but the Minister, who was asked during the earlier committee stages which industries might need this sort of protection, failed to answer that question. It is a valid question, Minister, and I'd like you, Minister, to answer, or to attempt to answer, that question. That's what you're paid to do. That's what you're sitting in the chair. We don't expect you to sit there like a dummy and ignore the questions and not do what you as a Minister have a responsibility to do. Mr Chairman, I said before that, notwithstanding the fact that this government's taken 6 years over this measure, I think that the measure is worthwhile. I think it does a number of things. It streamlines the process of responding to allegations against imported products and the need for the trade safeguards. It removes the temporary safeguard authorities. I don't think we need those now. The investigative work can be done by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. It enables a more realistic time frame to work through the trade safeguards. Currently it's 35 days. I don't think that is sufficient, and it increases the period to 75 days, and actually 85 days of provisional safeguards are being requested. And it also sets out clear criteria, and that criteria is set out in Clause 12 of this bill. I think they're sensible measures. The Minister has to, or the Chief Executive, must look at whether the increased imports are actually causing serious injury. He or she needs to look at whether the increased imports were due to unforeseen developments, whether they're necessary to prevent serious injury, if they're necessary, which goods should be subject to it, which measure is appropriate, what's the extent and duration of time. Those things are sensible.
Jamie Lee Ross.
I move that the question be now put.
I'll hear from David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was pausing because